The Shadows of Yharnam. The Shadows of Yharnam are three faceless creatures that appear to be connected to the Queen of Yharnam. Preparation. If you've cleared your way far enough into the Chalice dungeons, that Shaman Bone Blades are available from the inside shop. Bring 3. If you plan to use the cannon, be sure to bring Bone Marrow Ash. Bolt paper and weapons that inflict additional arcane damage, such as the Burial Blade, are very effective against 2 of the shadows. But the third is resistant to lightning and arcane, so you'll need a backup weapon and a purely physical damage type. The Chikage is also a good choice, as all 3 shadows are equally weak against its physical and blood damage. Scatterguns are useful for their ability to hit multiple targets, so consider bringing a Hunter Blunderbuss or Ludwig's rifle as well. Overview. The 2 swordsmen are weak against lightning and arcane damage, but the mace-wielding shadow is resistant to both elements. All 3 have low physical and blood defense, so melee weapons with either of these damage types, such as the Chikage, are most effective against them. The shadows with scimitars use the same fighting style, though the one carrying a candle can also breathe fire and isn't as aggressive with its sword attacks. In addition to basic horizontal and vertical slashes, they'll sometimes perform larger combos and heavy swings that can knock you down or launch you into the air. The mace wielder usually attacks with homing fireballs, though it will occasionally take a swing at you with its mace if you get close. It's the least aggressive of the 3, and has the lowest maximum health, but the damage from its fireballs can become a serious problem. During Phase 1, the bosses are limited to their basic attacks. The swordsman will chase you around the boss arena, while the mace wielder bombards you with fireballs from afar. When Phase 2 starts, the one carrying a candle will cover its blade with fire. The swordsman will use their knocked-out attacks much more persistently, and will begin performing long-range stabs and launchers. Any shadows remaining at the start of Phase 3 will periodically summon a trio of giant snakes, which will strike you individually at mid to long range. Strategy. Above all, focus on one shadow at a time to avoid triggering the next phase with all 3 still alive. Interrupts are the best way to deal with the swordsman. Staggers are equally as effective on 2 of the shadows that use fire attacks. Shaman Bone Blades will turn the bosses against each other, and can drastically turn the tide of the battle if used at the right time. All 3 shadows have no super armor, and any melee attack will cause them to flinch. Charged attacks from the heavier hunter weapons, such as the transformed hunter axe and burial blade, will knock them down, and are helpful for keeping them at a safe distance during Phase 1 and 2. If you have a shadow in a one-on-one situation, you can exploit their defensiveness with alternating R1 attacks, followed by a few steps forward while locked on. Most of the time, they will dash away after being hit, so by walking the distance they just dashed and using R1 again, you can lock them in an infinite cycle. As soon as you enter the boss arena, the 3 shadows of Yharnam will slowly walk towards you. He will mostly chase you down and pressure you with several melee attacks and combos. This one also has the most HP. The second shadow uses a Chikage with a candle, which breathes fire towards you. The third shadow uses only fire attacks, like homing fireballs and raining fireballs, which only threaten you at long range. The fireball using shadow also has the least amount of HP. All 3 shadows will enter phase 2 as soon as one of them has less than 30% of his HP, or all shadows are under 50% HP. As soon as they enter phase 2, all 3 shadows will have an extended moveset and will be harder to deal with. The key to this part of the fight is to focus on one shadow first and take them out as quickly as possible. Taking out the aggressive Chikage-wielding shadow is the smartest idea here, since he has the highest amount of HP and would be harder to deal with in phase 2. Taking him out can be achieved by separating him from the other 2 using the environment. There is a giant stone on the right side of the arena, which gives you cover from the fire moves of the other 2 shadows. Since the Chikage-wielding one is over-aggressive, interrupting his moves with gunshots is very easy and a good way to bring him down. Outside of that, he can also be stunned and taken out by well-timed dodges and rapid attacks. Always be aware of where you stand in the arena, since having your back against a wall will kill you quickly. Having an eye for the fireball user and fire breath user is also important, since they can overwhelm you very easily. If you manage to take out the first shadow, the fight will be much easier from this point on. The next wisest step would be to kill the shadow with the sword and candle. Of the 2 that remain, killing the sword and candle wielding one here is again the smart move, since he has more HP than the fireball user. In phase 2, the sword wielders will gain whip thrusts and whip uppercut. To make it easier to dodge these moves, either dash sideways when they use them or stay close to them, which is not too difficult when the Chikage user is dead. The fireball user will gain another variation of his fireballs, which now can cast an AoE that damages the ground mid-range. Focus on one shadow now and kill them. If you do so, the last shadow will enter phase 3, where he will summon a giant snake that attacks at close to mid-range, depending on where you stand. Dodging the snake is rather difficult and sometimes very tricky because the attacks of the snake are very quick. It can be dodged by constantly dashing, though. The best way to finish the fight in phase 3 is to kill the last shadow before he can summon these giant snakes. To do so, you can stun the last remaining shadow by constantly attacking him. Also, pushing him into a corner will limit his moves. This way, he will not summon a snake, and he will only try to attack you with his mace, or try to dodge your attacks. His mace up close can be interrupted by gunshots. Environment. The boss area's uneven border creates a large number of nooks and corners which can become death traps if you're backed into them. but the tombstones are essential for separating your enemies and blocking the fireballs thrown by the mace-wielding shadow. The nooks can also work against the bosses, though, and can be used to trap them if their constant backsteps are proving troublesome. Old Hunter summons. Old Hunter Heinrich, Confederate, along the walls at the intersection leading to the boss area. Requirement: he will not appear unless you have defeated him at the Tomb of Odin, and are wearing the Impurity Rune. Younger Madaros twin, Confederate, in the corner of the small gated area opposite the boss room. To the left of the corpse in front of the giant tombstone holding the clockwise metamorphosis rune. You cannot summon him if you have already killed him outside the small windmill or are not wearing the Impurity Rune. Notes: upon the death of the Shadows of Yharnam, the Forbidden Grave lamp will spawn. The giant snake summoned during the third phase of the fight can be damaged. Unfortunately, their health refills immediately after receiving damage, and therefore cannot be killed. All enemies and bosses, except hunter enemies, have 999 frenzy resistance. Despite this, they are still vulnerable to such attacks. The only way to see it without modding, however, is to use the Shaman Bone Blade on enemies to inflict frenzy to attack others. All three, Sword, Sword and Candle, and Mace and Fireball, are present as regular enemies in Murgo's Loft Middle in the Nightmare of Mensis. A common misconception is mistaking the mace, which is the Shadow of Yharnam mace, and Fireball using, for the Tonitrus. After a closer look, we can see this is a heavier mace with less intricate design. Attack patterns. Phase 1. Sword, Sword and Candle. Upward slash. Swift close-range launcher used in combos and on its own. Running slash. Mid-range running knockdown attack. Sword combo. Up to 5 rapid swings and a delayed 6th swing. Sword and Candle. Fire breath. Mid-range fire breath with continuous slow tracking. Mace and Fireball. Triple homing fireball. Launches 3 long-range fireballs. Phase 1 Strategy. Hit-and-run tactics are the safest strategy while being pursued by all 3 shadows. The giant tombstone is especially helpful for separating them, though beware that the mace wielder's fireballs can sometimes curve around it. Interrupt the sword shadow and finish it with a visceral attack, or stab it with a shaman bone blade before it gets up and lure it toward the others. Don't get greedy with melee combos during this phase. Instead, use single R1 swings or quick-stepping attacks, so that you can keep moving out of your enemy's reach. We recommend defeating one of the swordsmen first to reduce the pressure during the later phases. But the mace wielder is the easiest target during phase 1, and getting rid of it early will prevent you from having to constantly watch for fireballs. Attack patterns. Phase 2. Sword, Sword and Candle. Whip thrust. Long range forward thrust with slightly delayed startup. Whip uppercut. identical to the sword-only version, long-range launcher. Mace and Fireball, triple raining fireball. Throws 3 arching mid-range fireballs that converge on your location and create large spherical explosions. Phase 2 strategy. When one shadow's health drops below 30%, or all 3 reach 50%, snakes will burst from their bodies and will begin using their Phase 2 attacks. Finish the weakest shadow as quickly as possible, and continue using hit-and-run tactics on the remaining 2. As before, focus on a single shadow and use the tombstones for cover. But beware that the sword wielder's whip attacks can hit you through the giant tombstone. Interrupts, staggers, and knockdown attacks are still the most effective melee strategy during this phase, and with one of the swordsmen gone, you'll have a safer and more frequent opportunities to interrupt the others. Attack patterns. Phase 3. Sword, sword and candle, mace and fireball, snake summon. Summons 3 giant snakes that perform long or mid-range strikes depending on their distance to you. Roll in any direction to dodge. Phase 3 strategy. When all 3 shadows drop below 25% health, or only 1 remains, the survivors will begin summoning giant snakes that will attack you from far away. If the snakes appear near you, stand as close to them as possible, and roll sideways to avoid their attacks. Otherwise, watch them carefully, and dash or roll away when they strike. Finish any weakened stragglers immediately, and pressure the remaining shadow with melee attacks to minimize its opportunities for summoning the snakes. If you're having trouble hitting it, back it into a corner along the outer edge of the arena. Martyr Logarius. Logarius donned the crown of his own volition, determined to prevent a single soul from stumbling upon the vile secret. What visions did he see, sitting serenely upon his new throne? As the great Logarius once said, acts of goodness are not always wise, and acts of evil are not always foolish, but regardless, we shall always strive to be good. Preparation. It's much easier to interrupt Logarius with single-shot firearms like the Hunter Pistol and Evelyn. So bring one along and don't forget to stock up on quicksilver bullets. Stock up on bone marrow ash and blood vials, and be sure to have a weapon with a fast one-handed charge attack, such as Ludwig's Holy Blade or one of the saws. Fire paper is optional, but not necessary. It will add a few extra points of damage to your attacks, but not enough to make it a priority purchase. If you've obtained the Retirpalash from the lower sections of the castle, consider equipping it in your second-hand slot. You can use it as a right-handed gun for strategies involving the cannon or the flame sprayer. Overview. Logarius is an extremely fast and agile opponent, but many of his attacks are highly predictable and provide excellent opportunities to interrupt him. During Phase 1, he'll bombard you from long range with large clouds of dark spirits and use quicker versions of these spells up close. His melee attacks at this stage are consistent of slow scythe combos and faster sword slashes. He'll respond to frontal attacks and punish you for standing too close by using either a nearly instant frontal skull blast or a delayed explosion. He'll immediately use these techniques, or a quick sword slash after standing up from a visceral attack. At the start of Phase 2, he'll perform a spirit wave, surrounding himself in an aura that deflects bullets, and even arrows from Simon's bowblade, and grants him an enormous amount of super armor. Then, he'll assault you with swift melee combos and flying slashes, while periodically summoning a cloud of swords that will rain down on you from above. Logarius is strong against all elemental attacks, but is least resistant to fire. His physical defense is much lower, however, so melee weapons augmented with fire paper will inflict the most damage. Strategy: interrupt Logarius's attacks during both phases, especially the second phase when his super armor prevents you from knocking him out of his animations. If you have the Returpalash, you can use its transformed gunshots to interrupt Logarius with a powered-up cannon in your left hand and deal severe damage to him in a staggered state. Rather than perform a visceral attack, when he covers himself in his spirit aura, make every possible effort to break his super armor. Doing so will dispel the aura and stagger him, allowing you to use the aforementioned technique or a visceral attack. Phase 1. Upon entering the boss room, Logarius will start casting skull spheres. If you run straight towards him, he will only cast 2 skull spheres most of the time. Dodge them by running past them, or running around them. If close to Logarius now, he will either try to hit you with his scythe, in which case you can just interrupt him and cause major damage with a visceral attack. If Logarius decides to cast a homing skull or a delayed skull blast at you, it is highly recommended you just dodge right through the attack and towards him using 1 or 2 quick steps. That way, you will be in range to hit him a few times with your main weapon, depending on what weapon you're using. Proceed with this technique till he dives his staff into the ground and charges up his armor. If Logarius charges up his armor quickly, get behind him and land a charged up attack on his back and perform a visceral attack. That way, you will deny him from his armor and make the rest of the fight easier to stun him and get your attacks in. Logarius will eventually ram his sword into the ground and summon phantom swords that rain from the sky. That means he is now in Phase 2. Phase 2. In Phase 2, Logarius will act way more aggressive towards you and will chase you down. If the phantom swords are in the sky, either try to hide behind a pillar and lure Logarius away from the sword rain, or try to destroy the sword in the ground that is summoning the phantom swords. Logarius will have a lot more sword and scythe combos now. The best way to deal damage to him now is to either interrupt his swings with a well-timed gunshot, or stay a few meters away from him and wait for him to do his aerial dive. After the aerial dive, you can land a charged-up attack with a fast-charging weapon, or hit him a few times with normal attacks. If he tries to cast his Spirit Wave, you need to back away and stay away for a few seconds, since the attack is not interruptible. Logarius's weakness here is his aggressiveness, which makes him an easy target for gunshot interrupts and visceral attacks. Environment. You'll face Logarius on the rooftop of Canehurst Castle. The roof has multiple slopes and obstacles that can be used for cover during the battle. However, beware that there are no railings or other barriers preventing you from falling off the ledge. The spires can be used to block Logarius's projectiles, and to create enough room for you to use blood vials if necessary. But pay attention to your position to avoid being backed up against them. The gabbled slopes can cause his melee attacks to pass over you, if he is far enough above you, and can also provide limited cover from his ranged attacks. Using the pillars as cover to dodge skull attacks, or the phantom sword, is very effective and make the fight easier for you. Logarius can get stuck on the pillars for a few seconds after his aerial dive, leaving him open for a counter. Notes: the pitch of the rooftop can make it hard to interrupt Logarius with gunshots. It's advised to move up to the flattened or nearly flat ground to parry him, because otherwise there's a high chance the gunshot completely missing Logarius. When Logarius performs phantom swords, smashing his sword into the ground, the best way to deal with it is to lock onto the sword and shut it down. The Spirit Wave move, where Logarius surrounds himself with an aura and deflects bullets, will work on Simon's bowblade arrows as well, forcing you to either switch to melee or fire your shots from a very close distance to actually hit him. Attack patterns. Phase 1. Homing skulls. Launches a wave of small homing skulls. Quick step sideways or forward through them, or block with the terrain. Skull Blast. Close range forward spherical attack. Near instant. Quick step backwards to avoid standing too close to him. Delayed Skull Blast. Creates a small stationary skull that immediately quick steps backwards. Then detonates the skull after 1 second. Quick step away in any direction. Skull Sphere. Charges a large sphere of skulls above him and sends it slowly towards you. No tracking whatsoever. Quick step forward, under or around it. Exploding Skull Sphere. Same as the Skull Sphere, but used at longer range, and explodes in a larger spherical blast on contact. Run around it or use the terrain or cover. Phase 1 Strategy. Bait Logarius's Skull Blast from long range and quick step forward through them to hit him with melee attacks. Or stand no closer than mid-range and wait for a chance to interrupt his scythe combos. Don't stand close to him during combat, or as he's standing up after visceral attacks, or you risk being hit by his extremely quick counterattacks. Instead, back off and watch his movements while you wait for a chance to hit him. By dealing heavy damage to Logarius in a short enough time period, you can delay or even bypass the trigger for his Spirit Wave when he switches from his Phase 2 attacks, preventing him from using his Super Armor aura. While his Skull Blasts and slower melee attacks leave enough time for you to quick step behind him and stagger him with a charged attack, he will always backstep away from you as soon as he recovers, making it impossible for you to stay in that position for very long. Attack patterns. Phase 2. Spirit Wave. Massive spherical attack with a 5-meter radius. Cannot be interrupted. Quick step backwards at least 3 times, or if you're close enough to hit with a charged R2 attack from behind for a visceral attack. Aerial Dive. 3 versions. Hovers in the air and dives at you after 1 or 2 second delay. Interrupt it or roll towards him as he flies towards you. Phantom Swords. Drives a sword into the ground, releasing a spherical attack and a cloud of swords that constantly rain down on you. Quick step backwards twice for the initial blast. Shoot or attack the sword in the ground to disperse the aura. Phase 2 Strategy. At around 70% health, Logarius will drive his scythe into the ground and begin channeling energy, signaling the start of Phase 2. While channeling, he will not flinch, but he can be hit with a charged R2 attack from behind for a visceral attack. In this phase, Logarius will begin using extremely swift combos with both his scythe and sword. At any time after this point, he may also perform his Spirit Wave if you don't keep constant pressure on him. His flying attacks provide the best opportunities to deal damage during Phase 2. When he dives in from a high angle, you can roll toward him and strike him from behind with a charged attack when he lands. And when he approaches low to the ground, you can interrupt him with gunfire. When Logarius drives his sword into the ground, back away and strafe sideways until it becomes targetable. Then, shoot it from a distance, or quick step forward and hit it with a melee attack. If you need space to use blood vials, use one of the spires between yourself and Logarius, but stand well back. His area attacks and some of his normal swings can still reach you on the other side. If you're too close, do not attempt to mount any frontal attacks, and be extremely careful if you have to quick step towards him. His instant melee attacks can easily stun you for long enough for him to trap you in a longer combo.